A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. So tausend Schabbat at this guitar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda
Geber with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is going to be the next installment on our Chasam Sofer series, part 3, and it's going to focus primarily on his rabbinate in Pressburg, today Bratislava in Slovakia, then Pressburg at the heart of the Habsburg Austrian Empire, and after a long hiatus, too long Yom Tov holiday season hiatus here, but we're back with the Chasam Sofer. It's actually just his yahrzeit just the other day, so it's very appropriate. Part 2 is by his birthday. Part 3 is right after his yahrzeit. We're continuing with the Chasam Sofer, and of course there are further episodes still available to learn about the life and legacy and times and leadership of Rav Moshe Sofer, Rav Moshe Schreiber Sofer, the great Chasam Sofer, leader of Hungarian Jewry in the modern era and the father of Orthodoxy. So, we're going to talk about him in Pressburg, his community, his relationship with his community, how he got appointed, the yeshiva that he opened there. I want to open up with just some letters of feedback about part 2, the last episode, which was way long ago, before Yantiv, about, a month ago or so. I got a letter from someone, letter is email, I'm just old-fashioned, from someone. A few of them were about, I'll say before that, a few of them were about, I mentioned about how the Chasam Sofer was a misnagid, he was opponent to the Hasidic movement, and I got a lot of feedback about it. I think one day we'll have an episode just about that, devoted to the topic, because I see that a lot of people enjoy it, and it's an important subject for everyone, and especially with all the revisionism today, making him retroactively into a chassid, and definitely how he is revered by the Hasidic community in our contemporary society. So it's obviously going to be tough to grapple with the fact that he was a misnagid. So a few of the letters address that point. So I'm going to read, we'll see, one or two of them at least. We'll see how long it takes. One point, though, I must strongly object to is that the Chasam Sofer, you said something like, was somewhat a misnagid. What nusach did the Chasam Sofer personally pray in? Nusach Arizal. When he was called to daven as the Shliach Tzibur, then the Chasam Sofer daven Nusach Ashkenaz. Moreover, the Chasam Sofer has a tshuva on the distribution of Chalukah in Yerushalayim. The Chasam Sofer over there makes a comment regarding Hasidim and Misnagdim equally sharing Chalukah money. This is not a Misnagdic view. So that's one letter. I'm going to read a second one before I respond. Another letter writer. I was very surprised that you called the Chasam Sofer a Misnagid. I understand that the Chasam Sofer had concerns about certain customs of Hasidim, but that does not label him in general as a Misnagid to Hasidim and Hasidus. The Chasam Sofer actually quotes the Tanya in his Sefer, and it is quite obvious that he studied Hasidus. There are many sources that the Chasam Sofer was involved in the study of Hasidus and its minhagim. So, I want to clarify. And first of all, I mean, there's no question about it that he was a misnagid. There are tens and tens of sources for it. He writes it in every other tshuva about the new Hasidim and changing custom. And I mean, there's nothing to talk about. If anyone has read both the history seriously and the Chasam Sofer's own writing seriously, you'll see it all over the place. And like I said, I will hopefully devote an entire episode to it one day, and we can talk about it. I just want to address these points here. You notice the first letter writer wrote about his personal nusach, Arizal, which is complicated. It's something that we can get back to. What did he pray personally? It definitely had nothing to do with the Chasidus of the Baal Shem Tov. It had to do with the fact that he was a student of Rav Nosson Adler, which is the old type of Chasid, which is a good topic in its own right. When we talk about, eventually, one of these episodes will also talk about the Chasam Sofer's youth and his relationship with Rav Nosson Adler and what the whole situation was in Frankfurt between Rav Nosson Adler and the established community and his unique customs and how the community responded to his little group there, of which the Chasam Sofer was a upstanding member. So that's point one. The second thing is that Chasam Sofer was pro the distribution of equal distribution among Hasidim and Misnagdim of Chalukah money in the old yeshiva. I don't see why that's not a Misnagdik view. The Chasam Sofer was a fair person. He was a Yeki from Frankfurt. Why wouldn't he be pro equal Chalukah? And then the second letter about him studying Tanya and Chasidus. Of course, why wouldn't he study Tanya and Chasidus? The point of the Chasam Sofer's Hisnagdus was changing from local custom. This is what he fought about his whole life. And anyone who separates from the established community, anyone who changes local custom, in the social sense of Chasidus, not in what he davened, not in what he studied, in the Torah he studied, it has nothing to do with anything. We're talking about Chasidus in the communal sense, in the social sense of what the Chasam Sofer stood for, and the cohesiveness of the Jewish community in the face of the onslaught of modernity and the political changes and the reform and all that. So he wanted a strong traditional response of not changing custom. And what was the Hasidic movement representing? Changing custom, changing the establishment, changing everything. So the Chasam Sofer was simply opposed to that, and it's very understandable, and there's nothing to get excited about. But again, like I said again, it's something that we can go back to. There's another letter here on a different topic of the Chasam Sofer, which I mentioned in the last episode. He says, first of all, regarding Chadash Asr Min HaTorah relating to a Chumrah, I don't think that the Chasam Sofer would have an issue with a Chumrah Psak per se, which was not in accordance with the prevailing custom. In a vacuum, I think that in light of the defense needed to protect from change on the left, it necessitated a complete no-change approach, even from the right. Better staying with the complete status quo than risk any change. Of course, I agree with this letter writer completely. That's exactly what the Chasam Sofer was saying, and I guess I should have been more clear when I stated as such in the previous episode. And here's one last one from quite a proficient Talmud Chacham and rabbi who listens to the podcast and responded to me. It was very nice of him. He writes as follows: you refer to the Chasam Sofer instructing his students not to oppose the local custom in favor of their own more stringent rulings. Attached you will find a teshuvah where the Chasam Sofer himself, as the rabbi of Matzdorf, allowed a lenient local custom in Hilchas Treifus to continue, even though he opposed it and considered it halachically incorrect. When he went to Pressburg, he imposed a more stringent practice on the shochtim there, as per his own psak. It is fascinating, though, to see the way the Chasam Sofer answered this question, which concludes an enormous kula, which is exactly the point that we were saying before. And like I mentioned in part two in the last episode, this whole idea of Chadash Asr Min HaTorah, he used it in various contexts, the Chasam Sofer, and he used it, for instance, which I didn't mention last time, against the Noda B'Yehuda, the previous great Gadol Hadar, the previous great halachic authority who the Chasam Sofer was kind of in his shadow during his early years in the rabbinate. He opposes many psakim of the Nadi B'Yehuda. He opposes the whole methodology of the Nadi B'Yehuda. That's what Moshe Kahana's book is all about. His incredible book, which I keep going back to and I use as one of the main sources for these episodes. So one time the Chasam Sofer, or maybe even more than one time, the Chasam Sofer refers to a psak of the Nadi B'Yehuda himself as Chadash Asr Min HaTeiros. This is not against modernity. It's a philosophy in halacha. One time the Chasam Sofer even uses the phrase against one of his own chidushim. He says this chidush that I wrote is incorrect in Chadash Asr Min HaTeiros. So it was used in a wide variety of contexts, and it was pretty much never used by the Chasam Sofer himself as a general condemnation of the modern world or of modernity. That's been a much more recent development in the legacy of the Chasam Sofer, not by the Chasam Sofer himself, and it's very debatable if the Chasam Sofer himself would have ever used the phrase Chadash Asr Min HaTeiros in such a context. But as I've said before, the Chasam Sofer has become much more of a symbol than a historic figure, and that's why there's a need for so much revisionism about him and his leadership in recent years. So let's move on to his relationship with the Pressburg community. Just one more digression. I saw in the news this morning, about a close-up picture of an ant's face. And it's like this spooky, scary, terrifying picture, and it was supposed to be very scientific, and the photographer won all kinds of awards for taking this picture under a microscope. It's, in the scientific photography world, this was supposed to be exciting news. What struck me as historically funny was that it was taken by a Lithuanian photographer. And I said, wow, the Jewish people lived in Lithuania for 800 years, and look at the cultural similarity that they still have. This going down into the nitty-gritty, going under a microscope to take a close-up picture of an ant's face just to see how scary and terrifying it looks. You pretty much can't get more Litvak than that. So that's just in the news. So let's get to the Chasam Sofer in Pressburg, the town, the yeshiva. The Pressburg, the town, had a prestigious Jewish community, an ancient Jewish community. It was a couple of thousand Jews at this point in history, talking about the early 1800s. Chasam Sofer gets appointed there in 1806 and remains there for the rest of his life, as is well known, for 33 years till he passes away in 1839. So it was a relatively large Jewish community for Central Europe. It was obviously, if it would have been in Eastern Europe, it would be a relatively small community in Eastern Europe, but we're not in Eastern Europe, we're in Central Europe, and in Central Europe this was considered a fairly large Jewish community. And again, I used Moshe Kahana for my primary source, although I used other sources as well. And Bratislava, which is it's known today, most will notice its proximity to Vienna, and it's right next to Vienna. And Vienna is the center of modernity. It's the capital of the Habsburg Empire. It's not terribly far from Prague either, even though even today it's a few-hour drive, so it definitely is not next to Prague, but it's quite distant from Prague. But in the general sense, they're both in the Habsburg Empire. And Prague and Vienna have this influence on spreading modernity throughout the Jewish world, especially in Central Europe. In fact, we could see how Haskalah, reform, comes from Germany, and we see how it travels. You can actually trace it historically. It's quite interesting. From places like Berlin, from places like Hamburg, where the first temple was in 1819. And it goes through Vienna and Prague to places like Pressburg and Budapest, and then travels from there to Galicia and Russia and beyond. There's actually a route that you can trace how the modern world and the Jewish Haskalah and the Jewish progression towards modernity spreads, and Vienna and Prague serve as kind of like agents, as kind of like middlemen, agents, as like mitavchim, we'll say in Hebrew, as like these they bring the Berlin Jewish Haskalah values through there to places like Pressburg, and therefore its proximity to Vienna plays a big role. Pressburg is a modernizing Jewish community. And if we look at the time that the Chasam Sofer arrives there in 1806, the Pressburg Jewish community is going through a process of modernization. Many of the wealthy businessmen in Pressburg do business in Vienna, do business with non-Jews in this modern Habsburg capital. And therefore, they are influenced by the values of modernity. Remember the Edict of Tolerance by Habsburg Emperor Joseph has already been passed in 1782. 1806 is the peak of the Napoleonic Wars. So this is a very dynamic era. Who is the previous rabbi before the Chasam Sofer arrives in 1806? So surprisingly, there was no rabbi for 5 years because of the infighting in the community between the traditionalists and the more modern trends, which was generally the more wealthy and people who controlled the kahal, controlled the Jewish community. Who to appoint? What type of rabbi should they appoint? So for 5 years, the position of rabbi is vacant. Before that, it was Rav Moshe Sofer, very, very important and prestigious rabbi. He was from Poland, a Galicianer from Poland. He had been imported. He actually had a halachic dispute with the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer, the Galicianer, Rav Moshe Sofer, when he arrived in Pressburg, he noticed that the community shaved. They were all clean-shaven. And the Chasam Sofer, who is a Frankfurt Yeki, he has this position which defends the shaving of Jews in Germany. Now, this is pre-modernity. The Chasam Sofer is saying this is a long-standing tradition of centuries from the time of the great Rishonim of Ashkenaz. He wrote a tshuva about it. This is the custom in Germany. This is unlike Poland, and shaving is the correct way to go. The Chasam Sofer has his long defense of shaving against the Rav Moshe Sofer's critique of Jews of Central Europe shaving, because he came from Galicia. So it's a very fascinating idea. Chasam Sofer has this very, very strong defense of shaving, and he anchors it in centuries of tradition of Ashkenazi Jewry. So he doesn't say that it's a modern thing. He says this is actually the traditional way to do it. So I think, as far as I know, this Chasam Sofer's tshuva has been accused of being forged, and people can't handle today's people can't handle Chasam Sofer tshuva like this being written. His traditional defense of shaving, so it's been accused of being forged and a mezuyaf. It can't be, but he definitely wrote it. Either way, Rav Moshe Sofer is buried right there next to Chasam Sofer. I mean, not next to him. Chasam Sofer is buried next to him in the Bratislava underground cemetery. But he's usually ignored because people usually go straight to Chasam Sofer. But Rav Moshe Sofer is right there. He was the rabbi in Tisminitz in Galicia. He was from Buchach. He had spent time in Brud, in the Brother Klois. He was known as an opponent of the emerging Hasidic movement. And in 1794, Moshe Sofer goes west. And he's the rabbi in Pressburg until his passing in 1802. When he was a rabbi in Galicia, he had a yeshiva, and everyone was a student of his. The Katsais, Hachaysha, and the Nesivis, the Maram Banet. His nephew and student was Reb Naftali of Ropshitz. He was a very prominent rebbe of the next generation of Galician rabbis. So he was the previous rabbi, and when he passed away in 1802, there began this dispute about who to appoint in his stead, and eventually the Chasam Sofer gets appointed in 1806. At the same time, there was this Av Bezdin, this Dayan of the Pressburg rabbinical court. For half a century, Reb Daniel Prustitz, he was born in 1759 and passed away in 1846. And in 1796, he is appointed as the Ravid of Pressburg. So this is more than a decade prior to the Chasam Sofer's arrival. And he remains there for the rest of his life. He passes away in 1846, which is 7 years following the passing of the Chasam Sofer. So he is there before him and remains there after him, and is there during the entire time period of the Chasam Sofer. It's kind of like a Tommy Henrik situation with Joe DiMaggio on the Yankees, but that's a different story. In any case, the two, Reb Daniel Prustitz and the Chasam Sofer, were extremely close. They worked very well together. Reb Daniel Prustitz turned down numerous rabbinical positions to stay on the Pressburg Bezdin, and he's also buried next to him in that underground cave. His descendants remained in Pressburg as Magidim. almost until the war. The Chasam Sofer's son, delivered the main hesped for Reb Daniel Prustitz upon his passing in 1846. So he's part of the story as well. He's part of the traditional element of Pressburg, who is one of the causes for the Chasam Sofer's getting for the Chasam Sofer's success in his rabbinical career, because he's always there in the background, and the two are very close. So ultimately, the Pressburg Kehila does hire the Chasam Sofer. They first considered Rav Moshe Banet, who was the rabbi of Nikolsburg and the chief rabbi of Moravia, but the progressive elements of the community, who were the wealthy elite businessmen, and they controlled the kahal, they wanted someone less well-known. Rav Moshe Banet was very well-known. Rav Moshe Banet was also older. They wanted someone younger. They wanted someone who the kahal would be able to control. So they said, we can control this young and unknown rabbi from Mattersdorf, where the Chasam Sofer was rabbi for the previous 8 years. And they said, he's young, he's not so well known, so it'll be easy for us to control him. He's not going to make too much traditional trouble, and we'll be able to move the community towards a progressive, more modern, more reform point. Now, they could not have read the situation more wrong, obviously, and history obviously would show that Chasam Sofer was anything but that. He was definitely young. That was the only thing that they were accurate about. Everything else they were wrong. He would not be easy to control, and he would not be excited about them moving the community toward modern and progressive direction. But again, let's take the whole picture into context. You have these wealthy businessmen who have ties to Vienna, who are more progressive, who are more modernist elements in the community, who control the kahal. And they want changes in education. They want changes in the synagogue. In the background, like I said, is the Edict of Tolerance that's been around for more than 2 decades. You have the modernist elements of the Pressburg community is much less ideological than Berlin. It's not about where the Jewish people should be fixed or where halacha should be fixed. It's more practical. This is the modern era. This is the changing times. This is the emancipation. This is the European Enlightenment. And it's just easier for us and our business and our wealth if we're more modern, if we dress more modern, if we can mix with the non-Jewish and integrate with the surrounding society more. And it's much more in a practical sense and external influences as opposed to an internal Jewish idea or ideology. This is also, like I said, during the times of the Napoleonic Wars. And Austria is even occupied by Napoleon for a short period of time until Austria defeats them, and then Napoleon comes back shortly afterwards, and Chasam Sofer, as rabbi of the community, goes through this, and he's exiled from Pressburg, and he comes back, and he gives a whole speech. There's a whole story about that as well. Perhaps we'll get to it another time. So it's his early years in Pressburg, immediately before his arrival and during his first years of being there, is quite exciting in the sense that the Napoleonic Wars are taking place with all the Enlightenment activity and the disturbances to the stability of the traditional community are concerned. So he has these conflicts with the Kahal because they have us very clear where they want the community to be headed, and they think that the Chasam Sofer will be complicit, being that he's young and unknown and inexperienced as far as their perspective is, which, like I said, would ultimately be proven incorrect. So the two are at odds. The two are at conflict. There's an attempt to open a Haskalah school in 1810, and the Chasam Sofer is able to block it initially, but then it successfully does open a decade later in 1820. And on the grounds of that school, a reformist minyan opens. So the Chasam Sofer is seen as the ultimate fighter for tradition, for orthodoxy, against reform, against change, and yet in his own community, he was unsuccessful at blocking it. And this has to be understood as part of the story, because a lot of what the Chasam Sofer's battles towards larger society, in the tshuvas that he wrote, in the leadership positions that he took for the larger Jewish community of Central Europe, much of it reflected his own struggles within his own community. In 1826, there's an attempt. Again, 1826 is 20 years after the Chasam Sofer had arrived in Pressburg. He's already world renowned. He has this yeshiva of hundreds of students. He's world renowned. He's been asked halachic tshuvas around the whole Central Europe and Germany and Hungary and everywhere. And yet, the community is still in the control of the kahal, which is wealthy, modernist, reformist. And they try to shut down the Chasam Sofer's yeshiva in 1826. And they try to drive him out of town and remove him from a rabbinical position. They go to the government, and it goes back and forth with the local government. And they're unsuccessful in their attempt, and the Chasam Sofer does stay in town, and is able to keep his yeshiva open. But it's a big struggle. The Chasam Sofer actually writes in a letter, very interesting, that someone says, you're able to sit towards the end of his life. This letter is much later, late 1830s. He said, you sit in your position as a king in Pressburg. Such respect that you have from your community and from your yeshiva and from your students. And he writes there, and he bemoans in this letter, he said, you think I look like a king in my later years now, but you don't know all the heartache and the struggles that I went through to get there. Because eventually, much of the kahal, the Chasam Sofer is able to influence much of the kahal to be on his side, and more traditionalist elements and more of his people get voted onto the kahal board, and things like that happen. Very often it's the Chasam Sofer's students who are able to be his warriors out there in the streets. So there's the yeshiva and there's the community. And there's a conflict between the two because the students are much more loyal to him. So that's an interesting dynamic as well, in the educational sense, that there's the community, the yeshiva, which is not exactly part of the community. He's the head of both. The students are more loyal to him than the community. One of the interesting stories is again, worthy of another episode. The decades-long dispute between the Chasam Sofer and his arch-rival, the reformist Rabbi Aaron Churin. Fascinating figure, and the arch rival, the exact opposite of the Chasam Sofer. He was a reformer and a student of the Noda B'Yehuda, and he in the Chasam Sofer engaged in this long battle of polemics for years, for over 20-something years. Against each other and their positions. He was the rabbi in Arad in Transylvania for 55 years or so, and he was responsible for a lot of the new reformist positions in the Austro-Hungarian Empire during that time. And Aaron Churin at one point visits Pressburg, visits headquarters of the Chasam Sofer. And the Chasam Sofer students from the yeshiva go out and demonstrate against him. They even threw things at him. Supposedly they even threw rocks at him. And there was a rumor in 1826 when the community tried removing the Chasam Sofer from the position that who would replace him. What was the rumor? It's not clear if it was a true rumor, but at least there was a rumor going around like that. Who is going to replace him? This same Aaron Churin. So this dynamic is taking place within Pressburg itself, and I keep on emphasizing it because, like I said, it's important to understand what the Chasam Sofer was dealing with in his local community in Pressburg to be able to understand what he was dealing with on the world stage as well, because very often it was a reflection of that. And it has an influence on his outlook and his leadership position over the course of his rabbinical career. So that is a little bit about Pressburg and his position there. We'll end with that at this stage of the episode. We're going to have to continue. The coming episodes of the series on the Chasam Sofer will be about his youth in Frankfurt. It will be about the development of the Chasam Sofer and how, in his later years, how he changed the method of his battles against reform, against change, and to strengthen tradition. He had different methods of doing it over the course of his career, which is fascinating to trace it, to look around that he was a brilliant man and he understood the real responsibility of leadership, and how he used different methods at different times to be able to strengthen the Orthodox and traditional world. And he was quite successful, actually, at what he did. So I want to examine all that and more in the next few episodes, and looking forward to hearing from you, feedback and sponsorship opportunities which are available. And this is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.